This is the story of Glasha and her sheep. There once was an old king named Nomglug, who could not see but could smell good. In nights of his youth he could sense without tooth the juiciest deer in the wood. His youngest son was named Woglug, who was handsome but still could fight good. Nomglug wanted in his son's wife a skilled chef who held her own in a fight. So he decreed in the 1 week she who served the finest meat would marry Woglug in a fortnight. All of the women ran to go hunt, to find and prepare and confront the rarest of beasts to bring to this feast of all feasts and impress Nomglug with their stunt. Glasha resigned with a sigh. She had never found the right guy. Small and now older, frankly dwarfed by a boulder, her hunts had always gone awry. She admitted with a weep her only chance was stealing a sheep from the human village nearby. Now this village was well known, for the dragon ignored it while shown weekly jousting fights given its unalienable right to eat the horse of the man outshone. That night Glasha suffered a shock, when the dumbest sheep in the human's flock stood fluffy and tattered when the rest of its kin scattered, chewing grass and not giving a fuck. Glasha took the sheep and into the woods she flew, over rivers and streams and valleys she knew. She slowed when she was nearing the cave of the dragon by the clearing. But the dumb sheep kept walking, as Glasha stood gawking. Through blackberries it tumbled, caught itself, and then stumbled through dandelions with a huff, dispersing that white fluffy stuff right into the mouth of the cave. The dragon inhaled the fluff up its nostrils. The sheep, unaware of its current perils, didn't notice it let out a sneeze, catching fire to the sheep and all of the trees. Glasha let out a gasp as her prey was ablaze, and then stayed quiet so she could the situation appraise. She waited and realized the dragon was asleep, and snuck down the hill to retrieve her sheep. As she entered the village, the woman they laughed at the charbroiled sheep slung up on her back. Nomglug stood up as if out of a coma, shouting into the crowd, "What is that aroma?" Following his nose, he hobbled to Glasha and the sheep. Taking a bite, he exclaimed, This is what I wanted to eat." The blackberries gave it such a unique taste, raw on the inside, but char encased. The king inquired, "What is this treat?" Glasha replied, "My king, it's a dragon grilled sheep." Nomglug and Glasha were wed, and ne'er did she say that her dragon grilled sheep was a mistake that day. Recount the tale of Glasha and her sheep, and never wake a dragon from its sleep. That's better.
This is the story of Glasha and her sheep. Once upon a time there lived a king named Woglug, who was quite old but still could smell good. And when he was young, he could seek out pretty much anything with his nose. And he had a son named Nomglug who could fight pretty well. So Woglug thought, well, as a wife for my son, I would like someone who can fight good but still can cook good so that we all have good food that won't annoy my nose when it's being cooked. So he set out a notice to the whole kingdom that within a week, every woman in the land, or unmarried maiden in the land, should find and hunt a creature and cook it. And to be decided by the king himself, the winner would then marry Nomglug the week after. So all the ladies in the land went hunting for deer and elk and basilisks, and Glasha, who was very, very tiny, even smaller than a boulder, realized that she could not hunt. She was too small, so she went to the human village where there were sheep and found a sheep that was not afraid of anything, even when all of its mostly because it was stupid. Even when all of its friends ran away from the dragon that swooped over the village, that sheep just sat chewing grass. So Glasha took that sheep and began carrying it through hills and valleys all the way back home, and at one point she tripped over a tree root and the sheep dropped and fell through blackberry bushes and brambles and rolled and rolled and rolled right until it fell, and through dandelions, and fell right in front of the mouth of the cave that was very, very big and Glasha knew housed a dragon. And Glasha froze and hid because the dandelion tufts that had clung to the sheep's wool were starting to float into the air and were being blown into the cave by a small gust. And then the dragon sneezed, and the sheep was burnt beyond recognition, but Glasha stood and noticed that the dragon still hadn't woken up, so she picked her way carefully through the boulders around the cave's entrance and picked up the sheep, trussed it to her back, and kept walking. And as she reached the courtyard where the competition was to be held, everyone laughed at her for, "What is that thing, that big blackened thing on your back? You surely can't be hoping to present this." But King Woglug smelled it from all the way from his throne and said, "What is that aroma? That smells like exactly what I wanted to eat." And the sheep meat had been charred, yes, but on the inside it was still rare, and the blackberries had infused, and the dandelions had added some little bit of grassiness, and the king tasted it and said, "This is exactly what I wanted to eat." And Glasha and Prince Nomglug were married, and presumably, though unstated, lived happily ever after.
Hello, this story is titled Glasha and Her Sheep. Once upon a time, there was a king who ruled a kingdom, and his name was Woglug. He was very old, but despite this, his ability to smell was very great, and he also had a son named Nomglug, the prince of the kingdom. The father, Woglug, wanted his son to have a wife, but he wanted his wife to not only be able to fight well, and not that that was really the important thing, but mostly to be able to cook well, so that way he would not be offended. His nose senses would not be offended by anything that she would cook. So he sends out a notice to the kingdom telling all women who are willing to go and hunt animals and bring back something to cook, and whoever cooks the best will be Yamgluk's wife. So he sends the notice out, and women across the kingdom start moving and getting ready to hunt. There is one woman, Glantha, who is very small, smaller than a boulder, and she's not really able to hunt, at least not the things that the others could. So she decides to leave the kingdom and comes upon a human village. Now she finds a farm full of animals, and these animals, some have left, but there was one sheep that stayed behind despite all of the rancor amongst the lands. Part partially because, well, it was kind of dumb. So Glantha sneaks up behind the sheep and grabs it. And she makes her way back to the kingdom, across hills, across valleys, sneaking around larger monsters or just other animals, wolves, basilisks, and scary things like that. And as she's making her way through the woods between on her trip, she trips over a root and drops the sheep, and the sheep is falling and tumbling through berry bushes and branches and leaves and other plants along the way, falling down and ends up in front of a big scary cave. And its landing is stopped by a dandelion bush, covering its wool in dandelions. Glantha runs down, but then realizes that there is a dragon in the cave and needs to hide. Unfortunately, it's a windy day. The wind blows some of the dandelions off the sheep into the cave, and the dragon sneezes, and thus the sheep is burnt beyond recognition. But the dragon is not awake, and Glantha sees this, so she gets the sheep and runs away as fast as she can without waking up the dragon. When she gets back to the kingdom, everybody realizes what she has brought, and they say, "What is this? This looks terrible. You think the king will eat that? It looks so gross." But the king, who's able to smell so well, smells her before she even reaches his castle, and he says, "Wait, this smells exactly like what I wanted to eat." Because as it turned out, by rolling through all of these plants, it had been seasoned and flavored with blueberries and the grassiness of the dandelions, and it was actually rare inside despite being charred on the outside. And as such, he eats the sheep, declares it the most wonderful thing that he's eaten, and Glantha becomes princess of the kingdom.
Hello. So this story is called Glasha and Her Sheep. Once upon a time, in a kingdom, long, long ago, there was a king named Glampum. And Glampum had this really impeccable sense of smell, and he was known for that all across the kingdom. And Glampum, the king, had a son named Yampum. And Yampum was getting older, and Glampum, the king, decided that it was time to find a wife for his son, Yampum. And so the king called his son in and said, "Yampum, it's time that you get married. And I want your wife to be able to hunt, but more importantly, I want your wife to be able to cook really, really well, because I have this great sense of smell, and I will be smelling whatever she cooks, and I want it to smell good, so she needs to be able to cook really well." So Yampum agreed, and the king sent out a decree across the whole kingdom saying that the women of the kingdom had to go out and cook something for the king, and whoever could cook the best thing, they would be able to marry the prince and become the princess. And so the women went out far and wide and started hunting lots of animals. But there was this one woman, Glasha, and she was quite small. She was smaller than a boulder, and she wasn't able to hunt like the other women. And so she kind of fretted, what do I do? But then she got an idea, and she went on a journey to find something that she didn't have to hunt, that she could still cook. And she came across a human village that actually was quite in disarray.
and there weren't a lot of people or animals there, but the farm she came upon did have one sheep left. And so she kind of snuck up behind the sheep, and she grabbed it. And she took the sheep and she started carrying it back to the kingdom and her village so she could cook it and serve it to the king. And on her way, she's kind of walking through the woods, walking through plants and trees, and it smells very woodsy and stuff. And she trips over a root, and she drops the sheep. And the sheep starts rolling and tumbling, and it rolls through berry bushes and grasses and over logs and through leaves and all sorts of things. And it finally tumbles and lands in a dandelion bush. And it gets absolutely covered in dandelions, head to toe, or tail, as it were. And Glasha is like, oh no, what do I do? Like, my sheep is all covered in dandelions. But just then she notices that the sheep landed at the edge of a cave. And it was windy, and just the turbulence from the sheep rolling kind of blew some dandelions into the cave. And inside this cave was a dragon, and it got all in his nose, and he sneezed, and out came fire from his nose, and he burnt the poor sheep to a crisp. But luckily he was sleeping and didn't wake up. And so Glasha kind of sneaks up and grabs her sheep, now more like a charred ball of sadness, and she carries it the rest of the way back to the kingdom. And when she arrives, all the other women, and in fact all the other villagers, laugh at her and say, oh, what is this crazy thing you have brought? The king will never like this. You can't even submit it. But the king, with his amazing sense of smell, could smell Glasha from far away. And he said, bring her here, bring her here. And he takes the sheep, and it gets prepared and sliced up, and he says, this is exactly what I was looking for. This smells so good. And he tries it, and it was in fact very good. And so that is how Glasha became the wife of Yampum and princess of the kingdom.
This is the story of Glasha and her sheep. So, once upon a time, in a fantasy setting, there was a kingdom known as Iron Sheffield, where King Glampum lived with his son Prince Yampum. And King Glampum had it was an open secret that he had the sharpest nose in the land. Years of inbreeding made him had a keen sense of smell. One of those rare instances where it benefited him. But unfortunately, when you have a keen sense of smell, you smell everything, the good and the bad. And he said to himself, well, my son Prince Yampum, he needs to get married soon, and I can't have him marrying somebody who's not a good cook, because I hate smelling bad food. So he put out a decree throughout the land saying that the woman who cooked the best smelling dish, would be allowed to take his son's hand in marriage. And the decree went out, and all across the land, people began slaughtering animals and cooking them up for the king. And in one little corner of one forest, a young woman named Glasha, a young peasant woman, decided she would
participate in this contest. Why not find a way to rise beyond her station? So she took a trek into town to try to find some meat to cook for King Glompum and his son. She got into town, and all the other people there had, of course, already heard about the decree, and all the other single eligible women had already slaughtered all the good pigs, the good cows, and chickens, or had gone fishing. And she didn't have a boat or net. So on her way out of town, forlorn, she saw sheep. Not usually the best tasting meat, but meat nonetheless. So she grabbed it. She purloined the sheep. She yoinked it. Grabbed the sheep in both arms and went walking down the trail. It was a bushy sheep with lots of wool. It had not been shorn yet. I guess it was early spring, so they hadn't shorn the sheep yet. And the wool was up in front of the wool was pulled over her eyes, so she couldn't see where she was going all the time, and she did not see a root sticking out from a tree as she was walking through the forest, and she tripped and dropped her sheep, and the bushy, fat sheep went rolling down the path in the forest, and it rolled through a blackberry bush, and mashed up the berries, and they went all in its fur and went pink, and then it rolled through some bay leaves that got stuck in its fur, and then it finally it bounced into a rosemary bush, rosemary plant, and came to rest there at the mouth of a cave. Unfortunately, that rosemary plant was right next to some dandelions, which were disturbed and are known for being very, what's the word? Sporesy. They had little spores or pollen in them. So it disturbed the dandelions. The dandelion powder went flying off into the mouth of the cave, and unfortunately, there was a dragon that lived in that cave. And the dragon, which was sleeping, was not quite awoken, but disturbed enough by the pollen to sneeze in its sleep. And dragons, when they sneeze, they also breathe fire. They sneeze fire. So the dragon sneezed fire, and flames spurted from the mouth of the cave and scorched the sheep to a crisp. Sheep was dead, scorched to a crisp. And Glasha, finally catching up to her sheep, which was freshly scorched to a crisp, she said, "Oh no," quietly, because she didn't want to disturb the dragon. She picked up her sheep, which by now was cool enough to touch, and said, "Well, if this is the best I've got," and she carried it home. The next day, as everyone gathered at the castle to showcase their dishes, Glasha showed up with her sheep, and the other women, they pointed and laughed at this crazy woman with an entire sheep that looked like it had been through hell. And Glasha thought that surely she had lost. But from high in his tower, King Glompum he heard with his nose the sheep entering the castle courtyard. And he said, rosemary, bay leaves, and blackberries. That's a compelling combination. Those flavors dance on the palate like a waltz. And he went down into the courtyard and he declared that Glasha, the owner of the sheep, would be the winner and would take his son's hand in marriage. And Glasha lived happily ever after in that definitely happy marriage. The end.
So, I've forgotten everything. Once upon a time, there was a king named Glotham, who had a son named Pippin. And the son was a prince who didn't have a princess, and the king of the kingdom, Glotham, was well known for having a very acute sense of smell. But this wasn't always a good thing, because it meant he smelled everything all the time, and not everything smells good. So he declared that whoever his son Pippin married, she would have to be an excellent cook, because he didn't want to be smelling anything bad. So he decreed to the land a competition, a cook-off for whoever, whatever maiden could cook the best smelling dish would win his son's hand in marriage. And so every eligible bachelorette in the kingdom began slaughtering their good meats and preparing their food. And in one corner of the forest, there was a young woman named Glasha. Sounds a lot like the king, but it's not. Glasha. And she wanted to rise above her station by winning this competition. So she went into town, but all of the best animals had already been slaughtered by the other women, so she was very sad, and she didn't have a boat or net to go catch fish. And on her way back home, she spotted a sheep, a wild sheep that had not been shorn, and it was very large, and so she picked up the sheep and started walking back home to prepare it. But the sheep was so fluffy that the wool was pulled over Glasha's eyes, and she couldn't see when she tripped over a root in the path. And as she did so, the sheep went flying and started rolling down the hill, and it rolled through a bush of blackberries, and the berries stained the sheep's wool pink, and it rolled through some bay leaves, which also stuck to the wool, and finally it fell through a rosemary bush, and some of the rosemary leaves got stuck in the wool as well. And at the very bottom of the hill, there was a patch of dandelions next to a cave, and as the sheep hit the dandelions, the pollen went everywhere, and it got stuck all over the sheep's wool and went into the air and went into the mouth of the cave, where a dragon was sleeping. And the thing about dandelion spores is that they can cause things to sneeze. So the dragon, being a dragon, had very bad seasonal allergies and sniffed some of the spores and went, "Achoo!" And since it's a dragon, fire came out with the sneeze, and it accidentally cooked the sheep alive. Rip. Glasha ran down the hill after her prize sheep that she stole and found it burned to a crisp. And she said, "Oh no," very quietly, so that the dragon wouldn't be disturbed by her. And once the dragon went back to sleep, she picked up the burned to a crisp sheep and said, "Well, I guess this is all I can offer. It's the best I can do." So she went to the cooking competition and presented her sheep there, and was mocked by the other maidens who had made magnificent dishes for the prince and the king to try. But the king, as soon as she entered the palace, smelled, ooh, it smells like some rosemary and blackberry and bay leaves. That's a great, it's like a waltz for the palate. And said, "This is clearly the winner of the competition." And so Glasha married Prince Pippin, and apparently it was very happy.
The fuck, Sarah? What in the actual fuck? Okay, sure, we're gonna give this a shot. So, once upon a time, in a faraway land, there lived an orc, I think. It was either an orc or an ogre, I can't remember, but it's an orc. I think it's an orc. We're gonna go with orc. An orc named Glotham. And he had a son named Pippin. even though it's probably not Pippin, but that's what Emily gave me. And Pippin, the prince, didn't have a wife, didn't have a princess. So the king decreed that there would be a competition to determine who would be the princess. And the king, Glotham, had a very strong sense of smell, which could be a good thing sometimes, but could also be a bad thing because there are some things that just don't smell good. So the king, Glotham, decreed that there would be a competition, a cooking competition. Whichever maiden could cook the best dish, the best smelling dish, because the king didn't want to smell anything bad in his kingdom. So, or in his castle, I guess. So he decreed that whichever woman could cook, or man, I guess, doesn't matter, could cook the best smelling dish would be the princess of the kingdom. And so all the fairest maidens come and they start butchering the animals for this competition. And off in the woods, there lived this woman named Glasha. And Glasha really wanted to be the princess, so she went into town to find an animal that she could cook. But all the best animals had already been taken, so she's looking around and she doesn't have a boat and she doesn't have a fishing net, so she can't catch any fish or do anything like that, and she doesn't have a way to like catch another animal. So she's walking back home and she sees an unshorn sheep, very specifically unshorn, and it's big and poofy. And she goes, "Yes, I will cook this sheep." So she picks up the sheep and begins walking home to prepare the sheep to be cooked. And because the sheep was unshorn and she's carrying it and the wool is in her eyes, she can't see what's going on, so she trips over a root and she drops the sheep, and the sheep begins rolling down a hill, and on the way down the hill the sheep rolls into a blackberry patch and gets dyed pink because I guess there weren't enough blackberries to make it red or black, and then it rolls through a patch of bay leaves that were on this hill. And it gets stuck in the wool, and then it keeps rolling, and it runs through a rosemary patch, and the rosemary gets stuck in the wool, and at the very bottom it rolls into a clump of dandelions that were next to a cave. Except these were the puffball dandelions, and there happened to be a dragon with very bad seasonal allergies living in that cave. So the sheep rolls into the dandelions, and the dandelions go poof, and the puffballs, the little, I don't know what they're called, but the little things float into the cave, and the dragon has very bad seasonal allergies, and it sniffs the puffballs, and it goes, "Achoo!" And it sneezes, but because it's a dragon, it sneezes just this huge thing of fire out, and it charbroils the sheep alive, and the fuck was her name? Glasha, that was her name. Glasha runs down the hill after the sheep and goes, "Oh no," but very quietly so as not to disturb the dragon, and the dragon falls back asleep, and she goes and collects her sheep, which is now burnt to a crisp, and she doesn't have time to go find something else, so she decides, well, fuck it, and she goes to the competition, and she walks in holding this char-broiled sheep. But before the competition can even begin, the king, Glotham, I think was his name. Glotham. We're gonna go with Glotham. He sniffs and he smells this wonderful aroma of uh charbroiled sheep with hints of rosemary and bay leaf and blackberry, and the king says, "Oh, this is the most delicious thing I've ever smelled in my life. You are clearly the winner of this competition." And so Glasha and Pippin were married, and they lived happily ever after. Wink wink.
Okay, hello. we're gonna give this a try. Here is the story. A long time ago, in a kingdom far, far away, there is a king whose name is Glasha, I think, who has a son, whose name I forget already. So there's this king and his son, who's the prince. And the prince is unmarried, not dating anyone or whatever. So one day, the king decrees that the kingdom is going to find this prince a princess. And he decrees that there's going to be a competition, that all the maidens from across the land need to bring a dish. It has to be a very tasty dish, and this king in particular has a very sharp sense of smell. He can smell anything. So he decrees that they all have to bring food, and the maiden with the best smelling dish gets to marry the prince and become princess. And far away in the woods, there is a maiden whose name I also forget. Is it Glasha or something? There's a maiden in the woods. Her name is Glasha, I think. And she really wants to be the princess. She's like, okay, I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna find things to make this food for the prince so I can become princess. But the problem is that everyone else, every other maiden, has found all the fish and meat and cows and stuff to make their food, so there's very little stuff left around in the area for her to cook and make. She's like, uh-oh, what am I gonna do? And eventually she comes across this sheep, and it's a very big, poofy sheep, an unshorn sheep. She's like, okay, great, I'm gonna use this. But the sheep is so woolly and so unshorn that like when she picks it up to carry it, she can like barely see where she's going. So she's carrying the sheep. It's really big and puffy. She can't see where she's going, and she trips over a root. And as a result, she drops the sheep, and the sheep starts rolling. It rolls down a hill. It rolls into a blueberry patch, and it becomes all pink from all the popped blueberries. And it rolls into a patch of bay leaves. It has a bunch of bay leaves stuck all over it. It rolls into something else. It rolls into a bunch of spices, patches of spices as it rolls down this hill, and eventually it lands into a dandelion patch. It rolls into the dandelion patch, and right at the very bottom of the hill is a cave with a dragon in it, and this dragon is very allergic. His allergies are really acting up. So this sheep, covered in all the blueberries and spices and dandelion stuff, rolls into the dragon's patch, to the dragon's cave. Words. And the dragon sniffs the dandelions, and he sneezes. His allergies are acting up. Oh no, he sneezes. Except when he sneezes, he lets out this big billowy burst of fire, and it burns the sheep to a fine crisp. And this maiden runs after the sheep. She's like, uh-oh, my sheep, it's all burned. Oh no. And she figures there's no time to actually like cook the sheep. So she's like, all right, this is what I'm gonna have to deal with. So she takes the sheep, all burnt and covered in stuff. She brings it to the castle. She gets there right in time for this competition. And then she walks in with the sheep. And the second she walks into the room, the king is like, ah, what is that delicious smell? It's the best thing I've ever smelled in my life. And it turns out the smell is coming from the finely charred sheep. They're the roasted sheep with blackberry, bay leaves, and spices that just walked in. And she wins the competition. And she's very happy, and she and the prince get to live in quotations, apparently, they get to live happily ever after. Yeah, that's it. The end. Yay.
Okay, so there's this king, Glasha, right? And he has a really good sense of smell and a son. And his son is can't find a girlfriend. And so the king is really worried about this, and he does the and he puts out like a call for women to date his son, and to decide which woman is going to date his son, they all have to bring dishes, and whoever has the best dish gets to date the prince, and he gets to be the she gets to be the princess. So I think what happened next is there's a bunch of women who are making dishes, and then there's this one woman who doesn't know how to make food, but she wants to try, and so she goes looking for some meat, and she can't find any except this sheep, and it's really hairy, and so she can't shear it, and she doesn't know how to cook it, and she's getting really depressed, and then she decides to give up, and she's walking along a road, and the sheep falls and rolls down a hill into a farmer's farm, and it rolls through a patch of basil and a patch of thyme and some rosemary and some celery and carrots and green onions. And it keeps rolling and rolling, and it eventually stops just outside of a cave where a very sick dragon lives. And so the dragon sneezes on it, but because it's a dragon, it cooked it. But she didn't know it cooked it. She just thought it like, oh no, now my sheep is on fire. So anyways, she pats it down, and she takes it to the castle with the king and his son. And she's really ashamed, but she walks in, and the king smells it. And he's like, that's amazing. And she's like, really? And he's like, yeah, you can marry my son.
Okay, so once upon a time there lived a king named Gosham who had a son which was looking to be married but had very poor luck with girls. And so his the king put out a request for all the women in the land to come and have a cook-off. The woman who could make the yummiest, best food for the prince and the king could have the boy's hand in marriage. Now, many women, they came from all over the land to cook. And there was one woman in particular was very determined. She wanted to marry the prince, but she really had no idea how to cook. And so she tried, and she just couldn't work, and she went off, and somewhere in her inspiration she found this sheep that seemed like it might be very yummy. Unfortunately, it had very thick fur that she couldn't shear through, and so as she walked back home, sad and depressed with this sheep in tow, the sheep stumbled and rolled down a hill into a farm. And on its way down the hill, it rolled tumbling down over and over. It rolled through a patch of rosemary, patch of thyme, patch of sage, and it just kept rolling through some like carrots and onions in this farmer's field. Finally, came to rest with a clatter outside the cave of a great but ill, sickly dragon, who with this noise reached out and and a gout of flame washed over the sheep, cooking it almost perfectly. Now, the woman saw this, was terrified. She thought, oh no, she didn't realize it was cooked. She just thought it was dead. She patted it down and, in her sorrow, took it back to the king. But On arriving to the king, who had a very good sense of smell, noticed that parsley, that sage, that perfect spicing, the perfect cooked sheep. And in that instant, this woman, that is the most perfect meal I have seen. You, woman, may marry my son.